Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic. Let's do it. What sounds like a horror movie but happened in real life? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. 8 convicts escaped from a brutal prison in colonial Australia in the 1820s. After 100 days on the run in dense bushland, one was captured, Alexander Pierce. He told authorities they had resorted to cannibalism to survive, killing and eating each other until he was the only one left. No one believed him. They sent him back to prison. He escaped again, taking another convict with him. He was recaptured after 10 days and found with the other convict's remains in his pockets. This time, the authorities believed him. He was tried and executed. His body was dissected, and his head was sent to an American university. The 1955 Le Mans disaster. There was a wreck on the racetrack that launched debris into the stands, killing over 80 people, including an engine block that was blasted through the crowd like a cannonball, and the hood of a car that went into the seats, which the newspapers called a flying guillotine. Robert Pickton and the 49 murders he committed, all while evading Port Coquitlam police. The worst part is how he mixed the meat from his pigs with human meat from his victims and then sold it in local farmers markets. Health Canada only released statements and warnings not to consume the meat from his farm years after his arrest. Jonestown Massacre. Imagine being cornered at gunpoint and forced to drink something you know is poison and will kill you. Imagine feeling your child slip out of your hands and be murdered right in front of you. Imagine being so terrified but too exhausted to even react to it all. There's no escape. Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo's girlfriend and assisted him under threat of violence and various other ways men sometimes control their partners in the kidnapping, torture, and awe of young women, including her own sister. When they captured the pair, the police, or the prosecution, thought they needed her testimony to convict Bernardo. So she got a sweetheart deal. Guess who's been out of prison, living in a community under a changed name with a new husband, and now kids of her own. When I was about 11 or so, a little boy went into cardiac arrest on school grounds. I watched the PE teacher perform CPR until the ambulance arrived, which ended up saving his life. A few years down the line, I discovered that the same teacher was arrested for the double murder of his mother and stepfather. He burned them alive in the middle of the night. He was sentenced to life in prison in 2022 when I was 17. Josef Fritzl. When his daughter Elizabeth turned 18, he locked her up in a soundproof basement in his house. Over the next 24 years, he R'd and SA'd her and fathered 7 children with her, leaving some in the basement and others brought up in the house. He made up the story that she had run off and joined a cult. Her and her 3 children, raised in the basement with her, would eventually escape when her son had a medical emergency and needed to be brought to the hospital. She used this opportunity to alert the authorities. Elizabeth is doing much better, as are all of her children, who are getting along with each other despite their circumstances, and after a lot of therapeutic care. Her father is serving life in prison, where he had to change his name because other prisoners kept violently attacking him. Blanche Monnier was chained to a bed and imprisoned in a tiny room for 25 years because her mother disapproved of her choice of husband. Her room, when found, was covered in feces and rotten food, and she was nearly starved to the bone. She had never seen sunlight for the entire 25 years she was held captive. She ended up living the rest of her life in psychiatric care. Night of the Grizzlies. There's a book by this name and an old PBS documentary, which I think is still on YouTube. It's a true story, and it could make an amazing movie if done right. Both the book and documents are worth checking out, especially the audiobook. It really sets the mood leading up to the events. In the short version of the story, in Glacier Park in the US in the late 1960s, there were a lot of grizzlies in the park, and it's also a very popular place for camping and hiking. Basically, the etiquette around bears at the time was much less cautious than it is nowadays, and it was in fact reckless. There's a main chalet with rooms to rent, and they would leave garbage out right in the front, and the bears would come and pick through it for food scraps. Eventually, as this became a regular occurrence, they started intentionally leaving out more garbage to attract the bears so crowds could gather around and watch them scavenge for and fight over scraps. Just an insanely bad idea. Not only having that many people right near hungry bears who are scavenging for food, but at the same time acclimating the bears to human presence so they're more comfortable coming up to humans in the future, greatly increasing the chances of encounters and potential attacks. And, as you can guess, in one night, 2 separate bears mauled 2 separate victims who were camping on opposite sides of the park. Listening to the book is a great way to get the story as they set the stage and build up to it, and it's pretty mortifying. I'm hardly doing it justice by leaving out the details. Also, there are side characters that would be perfect for movie roles, almost to an uncanny degree. There is, no joke, a wise Native American guy who warns the park for weeks ahead of time that a tragedy is inevitable due to the lax behavior around bears. There's a doctor on site when one of the mauled victims is recovered, and there's a helicopter pilot who goes out on a night search to find the other victims. The whole thing reads like a brilliantly written fiction, but it's tragically true. It would make an amazing horror drama movie, in my opinion. David Hahn was a Boy Scout with a penchant for science. From an early age, he had read his father's chemistry books voraciously and experimented nonstop. From homemade fireworks to whipping up batches of chloroform, David's inquisitive mind couldn't be stopped. David was also a nuclear energy proponent. David was so enthusiastic, in fact, that he came up with a new experiment. David decided he'd build a breeder reactor in his mom's garden shed. Soon, David amassed radioactive material from all sorts of household products, like smoke detectors, camp lanterns, and antique clocks. David was quite resourceful, you see. Sadly, David was found out before he could ever complete his breeder reactor, but by then, he'd managed to create a neutron source that emitted radiation at around 1,000 times normal levels and put the 45,000 residents of his town at risk of radiation. His mother's home was declared a Superfund site by the EPA, which dismantled the shed and buried it in the steel barrels in Utah. But the best part of this terrifying ordeal was that unbeknownst to the EPA or anyone at the time, David's mother had already collected much of the radioactive material and thrown it out in the trash. And before I forget to mention, this was in 1995. I'm baffled that this hasn't been turned into a movie yet. I can't remember when this was, but I know a while back a whole bunch of scientists in a plant had to walk around with brooms held in front of them because there were hydrogen leaks all over the plant that had caught fire, and hydrogen fire can't be seen by human eyes. So if the broom caught fire, they would be safe-ish and able to report another leak. It may have been hydrogen, I can't remember exactly, but having imagine if you're just walking along and suddenly effing catch on fire. December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor takes place. The infamous sinking of the USS Arizona takes place, but a less-known story begins. The USS West Virginia was hit but leveled out. A room on the ship containing 3 young men is stuck underwater. Other men on the outside could hear banging on the walls, but if they tried to save the men, the water would burst inward and kill them. Afraid to kill the men trapped inside, the outside world kept the men inside their tomb. Body retrieval efforts took place in the May of 1942. Eventually, the ship's room was cracked, and what they found was 3 bodies huddled together, flashlights and batteries strewn about, and a calendar on the wall. The calendar marked 16 days. 16 full days in the dark below sea level with no escape. Every day running lower on batteries and food, wondering, does anybody up there hear us? I recently watched a really great and tragic video about those 3 sailors that were essentially buried or sunken alive. Very sad. But It's a part of history, and the effort to rescue them went a lot more in-depth than the inevitability that it wasn't going to happen. Just truly tragic. A future president, or as a child, becomes president, has 30-plus SA accusations against him, pays off a porn star who he effed while his wife was pregnant, no, not the one he R'd, his other wife, and commits multiple felonies, and the world barely talks about it. He's still running for president for the second time. If he wins, it's highly likely that Russia will attack Europe when the president dissolves NATO, because the Russians told him to. Sounds very balanced. I've been woken up on 3 different occasions and almost murdered. The first time my mother woke me, she told me to hide and be quiet because my dad was drunk and had fallen asleep with his shotgun after raging at her, telling her he was just going to kill us both. We live in the UK, so you can get guns legally, but he didn't, and he ended up in jail for selling guns. The second time, I was in the hospital having brain scans and a bunch of other tests to do with my epilepsy. One day, I was moved to a different ward, which wasn't unusual, except this time they moved me to a psych ward, and it was the only place that had spare beds. One guy would scream day and night, thinking the ceiling was caving in. Another thought I was a German spy coming to murder him. One night, I woke up as I felt the bed move, and there was this skinny woman sitting at the end of the bed, still half asleep. I think I said something along the lines of, hello, what are you doing? The woman then began to scream like the witch and left for dead and leapt at me, trying to scratch at my face. I started yelling for help, and it was only a short time before several nurses and ward staff grabbed her and dragged her off. It was only after a nurse was checking on me that she bent down and picked up a scalpel from the floor. It turned out she was from the secure ward and had escaped somehow. I didn't hold it against her, she was unwell. The third and final time, I was homeless, and one night I woke suddenly to a man climbing on top of me with a knife, and he tried to stab me in the throat. I'm not entirely sure what happened, but I managed to move my head in time, but got cut on the side of the face and ear. He eventually fought him off and managed to run away. I took cuts on the face, ears, hands, and back of my neck, as well as damaging my knees and ribs. Someone must have seen me as the cops showed up looking for a man covered in blood. Then they called the paramedics. One wanted to help me, while the other thought I was just trying to get a bed for the night. Now that I'm 39 and I can't sleep without a light in the hall on, I get occasional sleep paralysis episodes, which might be more frightening if I'm being honest than the others because I can't move, while at other times I could at least fight. So I sleep with the light on in the hall so I don't wake up in the dark and have a panic attack. Not afraid of the dark, just waking up in it. Nobody mentions Hasashi Aichi. He was kept alive long after his severe radiation poisoning or burning should have killed him, just to study the way that his body decayed while he lived. He eventually begged for death after having 3 heart attacks in a row and having lost all his skin. Or what about the old story of Aaron Ralston, whose arm was trapped by a boulder, after which he was forced to break and cut it off, then climb down a mountain and hike 6 miles before finding help. A man in my town murdered 4 people, 2 of whom were drug dealers. This man was at face value a really normal guy. Someone tipped off the police about his activity, and canines found 2 bodies buried in his backyard. They sent this man to jail. All while waiting for a sentencing, he constructed a 40-foot rope from his jail cell with bed sheets and escaped. He's currently serving his time after being caught shortly after his escape. Look up the article, Hugo Selinsky in Pennsylvania. Hasashi Aichi, one more time, was a worker at a nuclear fuel processing plant. On September 30th, 1999, Aichi and others were working with a machine for purifying uranium oxide, filling it with medium enrichment uranium oxide. Enriched uranium has a higher content of U-235, the fissile uranium isotope used in nuclear reactors. Despite having no prior experience with such a product, they overfilled the machine, and suddenly there was a bright blue flash that had inadvertently triggered a critically incident, meaning that some of the fuel had begun to undergo nuclear fission. For those in the know, This is the same thing that happened with the Demon Core at Los Alamos on 2 separate occasions. In that instant, Aichi, closest to the flash when it occurred, was exposed to 17 sieverts of radiation, the highest dosage of any human in history. For comparison, 4 to 5 sieverts is sufficient to be fatal. His death was absolutely inevitable. His DNA was essentially destroyed by the radiation, meaning his body could not repair or replace the damaged and dying cells as they broke down. And within a few days of the incident, his body was already beginning to break down. Nothing could be done to save him, but his family insisted that the doctors try anyway. They did everything they could to counteract the degradation of his body, including bone marrow transplants and restarting his heart when it stopped. Despite all rational sense saying it was senseless, and arguably pushing well outside of the do no harm mandate most doctors try to live by, I'm not going to give details on what he went through, nor do I recommend seeing the photos of him toward the end. I will, however, say that what was lying in the hospital bed resembled a fallout ghoul in the worst possible way. The result? Aichi lived for 83 days after the incident, suffering what has to be the absolute worst kind of agony a human can go through, until his body finally gave out entirely. I once went to a party where I saw a girl I'd been flirting with for a while. One thing led to another, and next thing I know, I'm getting a top-grade job behind the house of the party. Things were going great, until she decided to put a finger in my unexpectedly, and I lunged forward out of shock. That resulted in my junk tapping the back of her throat and her projectile vomiting an entire party's worth of beer and or sweet drinks all over my shit and down into my pants and underwear. Mind you, this was in the winter in upstate New York. All I could do was pull my shit up and start the 15-minute walk of shame back up to my dorm while forming tick-sickles of vomit. I entered my dorm, where I lived with 5 other guys, and the roasting began after I took a shower. I explained what happened as I made my way to the laundry room. That happened when I was 18, and I still hear about it 20 years later from them. Good times. Elmer MCC, the world's shittiest train robber, and a mummified corpse that got passed around America for a little over 60 years. Elmer was killed in Oklahoma in 1911 during a police shootout, and after nobody came to claim his body at the morgue, the undertaker decided to embalm him really well and let people come look at him. He was used on movie sets and circus acts for a while. He was even in a wax museum until people started to get bad vibes from his grotesque and mummified mortal vessel. He was left to rot in storage for a while until they sold his body to a funhouse, where he was painted orange. The TV series, The $6 Million Man, was shooting in the funhouse, and someone broke his arm off only to see bone and muscle. The EMTs reportedly laughed upon seeing the severe case of dehydration they were supposed to respond to. The 2002 Skynlyev disaster. An Su-27 of the Ukrainian Falcons misjudged its height during a loop maneuver at an air show in Skynlyev Airport and crashed into the crowd and some parked planes. It killed 77 people and hurt 543. Human meat was everywhere, and I say that only because you weren't able to tell who it had been or what part of a person it was. Some arms, some legs, a few heads, or bits of heads, and a stench of burned human hair, meat, bone, blood, and grease were mixed with fuel and more to create this overwhelming cacophony of smell. Nobody who was there was normal anymore. Children were orphaned, men and women lost their whole families or 1 or 2 children. This was early 2000s Ukraine. You just didn't have any good mental health support.